Hello, everyone, and welcome to the week one at 2321 International Political Economy lecture. So here are the learning objectives we're going to focus on today. Most of this lecture is dealing with the classical political economists who you have a few readings for this week, and these are the ones displayed on the screen here. And the purpose of this lecture is just to give you a bit of an overview of the importance of theory and theoretical frameworks in approaching issues in international political economy, and even more broadly. And as well set some context and background information to hopefully get the most out of your readings this week. So, firstly, what is a theory? Theory is very important for international political economy and most of the academic fields, including international relations and other areas of especially the social sciences. And it's important to note that we all have a theory. When we look at the outside world and interpret what's going on, try to have an understanding of what's happening, or even think about current events, we're all applying a theory. And it's just a matter of varying degrees of knowing exactly what theory we are using to understand the world. So one of the things that I want you guys to do over the course of this semester is become more reflective and self-aware of the theoretical frameworks that you're using to understand the world around you. So that's why theory is important, because we've all got one and we're all using it, but many of us just don't know it. So generally, theory, we can break it down in two components. One is an ontology, and the other is an epistemology. So an ontology is Greek for basically like things that exist. So when we talk about an ontology, like when we maybe you might see in writings like an article might discuss like an ontological focus or a relational ontology or whatever it might be. It's basically saying that the researcher is describing what they see out there in the world, like what elements are out there in the world that they can investigate. So this might be things such as, for instance, like for the natural sciences, it would be like material, right? So like things that you can see and touch. So the world out there is composed of, atoms that constitute, physical structures, right? This is like a positivistic ontology, which is very common in the natural sciences. Whereas in social sciences, there's a lot of other different ontologies, such as an ontology which looks at like ideas. The ideas out there which constitute the important components of the world. Or when we talk about materialism in social sciences, we're talking about the processes of production relations and broader production. So like, how do we make things that allow us to socially reproduce every day? And that's something we'll talk a little bit more about, especially in our critical theories. So again, ontology is like looking, what's out in the world, what exists there, how can we understand it? Whereas epistemology, which is from the Greek of knowledge, means like, how do we know about those things out there, right? So how can we investigate and understand those things? So again, thinking about natural sciences, because this is maybe what I guess popularly most people are familiar with, the epistemology of natural sciences is called an empiricist one. So, they can understand the ontology of the world or what is there, which is basically stuff, through accounting for it with the senses. So, you can see it, you can hear it, you can feel it, that kind of thing. So this is an empiricist epistemology. Whereas in social sciences, again, there's a whole different range of epistemology. So it might be like a historical epistemology, which might try to understand a process or phenomenon through its historical development and evolution, or a standpoint epistemology. So we're trying to understand a broader social issue through the standpoint of a particular person or maybe group. So there's a very broad range of ontologies and epistemologies, and we're going to keep coming back to these concepts as we build our theories because each theoretical framework in international political economy and elsewhere is composed of these two major parts. So it's very important to have an awareness of exactly what they are. So now let's talk a little bit about political economy and what political economy is. So generally, I guess the broad understanding of political economy is the interaction between a sphere we might understand as politics, and then a separate sphere we might understand as economy. And this is very much like a mainstream understanding of international political economy today, would say. But there has been a very a broad range of understandings of what political economy is. And one thing that we're also going to try to break down through this semester, especially by utilizing critical theory, is that there's no such thing as separate spheres in society. So, when you read the paper and you look at the economy section, for instance, and mainstream media and mainstream analysis separates the economy as some separate sphere which, can't be touched by politics or some sort. Through a critical political economy lens, which we'll build and discuss over the course of the semester, we can see that that is a total fabrication. Okay, there's no separation of spheres or areas in broader society, and everything is closely interconnected. But in terms of political economy, the actual broader, school and approach to studying, political economy was even originally understood as the economy of what's called bourgeois society. So from the very early history of political economy, which we'll get to in a moment, when capitalism was just developing and there was the creation of what we can now, with reflection and what critical scholars call bourgeois economy, society was developing. Right. So political economy was the understanding of this new developing capitalist society, which I'll use the same terms throughout this lecture, of bourgeois society. And political economy is the study of that developing society. And so it's very much firmly rooted in history itself. It looks how things unfolds, how it's transformed, and how it's generated. So that means political economy also has a history of its study as well. And so in this lecture, I'm going to touch on a couple of really important thinkers, which will then hopefully animate your reading. And so the study of political economy itself is also very much a science, which is kind of based on identifying the developments of the schools of thought over time, which will then help us understand the focus of political economy studies more deeply as well. So, and I've just briefly noted here before I move on, sorry, that to understand international political economy, which is more or less the post-60s-ish profession of political economy reconstituted today, it's really important that we go back and understand the classics of political economy, because some of the debates that started back in the 1700s is still very relevant today. And like I said, it's very important for us to understand the development of and evolution of political economy for us to be able to understand the focus and the importance of the field of study as well. So we've already touched a little bit on what exactly is political economy. And then the next question is, well, where did it formally, start? And a lot of histories of political economy point to this one person, Francois Quinet. My French isn't very good, but as someone who was seen as the founder of classical political economy. And Quinet founded the Physiocratic school in the mid-18th century, and he was the first to introduce what was called a scientific system into political economy. So before him and his school of physiocrats, there had been, economic doctrines, and thoughts, obviously, about like economic policy, but no kind of broader understanding of society as a whole totality. outside of purely like economic policy implementation by governments. So the history of political economy in the proper sense of the term, we would say begins with Kine, whereas the preceding period can be seen as its prehistory. And so what's really important about when Francois began theorizing in the physiocratic system, this stage of history corresponded to the time where productive power had gradually developed under the feudal relations of production. And then that the strength and the power of production, which was evolving at that time, collided with I guess the relations between people instituted by feudalism. And so when we talk about like the production power or processes of production, we're talking about society's ability to make stuff, about how to produce wealth, how to produce value. And when we talk about production relations, this is the societal relations between people and objects, which are created by economic systems. So, for instance, feudal relations, for example, feudalism was a system more or less where there was, a widespread peasantry, which would, make products and they would be transferred to the local lord, for example. And so because of that production process of how things were made and produced, it created relations between the people concerned. And so the power of production had been increasing around this time that Francois theorized, and that started to clash with the relations created by the feudal system. And this was a period where ideologues representing the emerging capitalist relations of production sought, in the name of society as a whole, to replace the existing feudal relations with new ones. So the characteristic of the political economy in this period was a notion of this natural order was trying to emerge, and this natural order being one based off capitalist ideas. And this was contrasted to this like artificial order that existed in feudal relations. And the emergence of this natural order of capitalist relations was said to be based on the will of God, who wished for the happiness of humankind. And this is very much how the theorists of that particular time put it. And there's this image of perfect harmony where the various maladies of existing society were seen as the outcome of this feudal system that runs counter to that natural order. And so the task of statesmen at that particular time was to use the power of reason to make sure the natural order was reflected in the order of society of that particular day. So this natural economic order is very much one based on, like I mentioned, the capitalist relations of production, which is where, and we'll see this develop over the course of the discussion of the next couple of weeks, where capitalism started to obviously engender huge increases in productive capacity, which then started to change relations of production as more and more proletariats or working people were moved off their land and into the large factories of industrializing towns, which then created relations between employer and employee, which had not been common before that point. So this feudal system had really started breaking down by Francois Quesnay's time, and feudalism became a fetter to development of this more modern so-called natural order of capitalist relations. And so the physiocrats, which had centered on Francois Quesnay, was one of the main representative political economy at this time. And they were critiquing really the idea of mercantilism, which is a system that had imagined that value in society and its magnitude was created by exchanging stuff with other countries. And mercantilism is an early idea of political economy, even though it was not understood a political economy at that time, it was economic policy, which advocated the policy of countries and city-states at this particular time of promoting greater exports than imports, paid for gold and silver in order to use the funds generated to subsidize, the protection of export-orientated commerce and industry. So the balance of trade in the form of increasing, a country's gold and silver is the most visible form of, a nation having surplus value. And what brings it about is export-related commerce and industry for the mercantilists. And now the fundamental defect of mercantilism at that time, which was kind of the strongest theoretical system, was that it only looked at a very partial point of partial, aspect of the economy. So it was very, very narrowly focused. And political economy, which started to constitute itself as a science by the physiocrats at that particular time, tried to move the focus from a partial view to an overall perspective of society, advancing from a subjective standpoint of merchants and politicians, where mercantilism came from, because it was based on their particular perspective looking at the economy, to a so-called objective and theoretical standpoint in political economy more broadly. And so the focus of these early political economists was to actually find out, where did value come from? Like, how did society create value? How did it create wealth? And the focus of attention was shifting it from the process of circulation, of money being circulated between countries that the mercantilists focused on, to the actual processes of producing stuff, right? And against the mercantilists, the physiocrats counterposed the notion that forms of production were physiological forms that arise from the necessities of production and independent of will and politics. So they looked at economics as a study of the social conditions of production. Mind you, the issue with the physiocrats we'll kind of talk about in some more detail soon is that they really focused on immediate production that they could see in its concrete form at that particular time. And for Quesnay and his followers, labor on the land, which was the most obvious thing they could see in 17th century France, was alone productive of value. Which then Adam Smith, as a later political economist, did also take ahead a little bit as well, which we'll touch on in a moment. And this particular narrowness of the physiocratic view, which saw all or most wealth in society and value created from agriculture, was kind of a reflection of the limited stage reached in France, in the French economy at that time, which was predominantly based on agriculture. And now one of the, this is a historical interest, I'm not going to talk about it in any detail, but you can see I've put here the tableau économique. Again, my French absolutely is terrible. This is a creation of Quesnay, and it's the essence of his political economy. And you can see it's like an attempt to systematize and objectify the processes of social reproduction, or how society reproduces itself, how it creates wealth, how it builds day to day under this so-called emerging natural order. And this was printed in Versailles in 1758, and it had a print run of just 4 copies, but is quite a famous document in classical political economy. Now let's turn our focus to the classical political economists. And this is the last part of the lecture today. And hopefully this will give you a bit of background as to these thinkers for your readings this week. Now, the classical political economists, and I sometimes myself put Quesnay into that, but I think, it's probably proper to say the Quesnay, Francois Quesnay was the part of the physiocratic school, and then following that, the classical political economists, before we touch on the critical political economists following that. So the classical political economists went beyond the physiocrats by looking in more detail at where value came from. Right. And keep in mind, both Adam Smith and David Ricardo were based in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom had a much more developed manufacturing sector. So when they looked at like how did society create value, that is where they started to look towards first. So it wasn't just in agriculture by itself, but they looked at society more broadly. And so the classical political economists sought to analyze the production of value through the concept of labor itself, more broadly, not just labor on the land, but the ability to produce value in society through general labor. So this concept of labor was freed from its kind of agricultural limits and making it possible for the early political economists to analyze capitalist relations of production to the greatest extent possible from their particular perspective. And at this time now, the relations of the capitalist bourgeois society had basically come into existence at that time. And so the most striking kind of characteristic of the early political economists at this particular stage was the faith in the capitalist mode of production and an earnest effort to try to clarify its laws. So this was a very turbulent time. Capitalism had been established. A large number of existing peasantry in the feudal system prior to that had been cleared from their lands, and there'd been a large amount of land accumulation, and then lots of people, for instance, in the UK, had been shuffled off to the industrializing centres in Manchester and London, and had to work for work to be able to afford to live. So previously in feudal relations, in their household, they'd have a farm, a housing plot, and tools and techniques of production, so they could produce the things that the family needed through the household, more or less. But then once the peasantry was kicked off their land in quite a long process, they then lost that ability to produce things themselves, and they had to go and search for a wage in these industrializing cities. And this created what we now term as the working class or the proletariat. And so the political economists at this time saw this process and wanted to clarify its laws. And so the capitalist relations to production were the object of study here. So like, how did relations between people at that time, which is expressed through employer and employee, had created or had developed, and how did that create and contribute to the creation of wealth? So it was no longer the laws of the ideal world that Francois Quesnay was thinking about to transpose against feudal relations, but they actually had become the laws of broader society. And quite early on, it became quite clear that it wasn't necessarily perfectly harmonious order as had been hoped. Like I mentioned before, it was this idea that there was this natural order coming through, which would, help settle all the problems that had been expressed in society. But these classical political economists did start to see very clearly the very obvious signs of a harmonious order not really being established through increasing poverty, health problems, and all the emergent issues with capitalist society at that time. And so the defects of the socioeconomic system in this period was considered to stem from an inadequate development of capitalist production. It wasn't quite right. There were some issues that had to be ironed over to retain and get to this natural order. So this meant that the economists at this stage advanced their understanding of the emergent capitalism with a very much problem-solving perspective. So they just wanted to iron out some of the difficulties of capitalism. And the outstanding representatives of classical political economy at this time were Adam Smith, who, amongst other things, very famously wrote The Wealth of Nations, and David Ricardo, who wrote On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which are both readings for this week. And like I said before, the physiocrats had been able to begin the investigation of where value came from. And I just want to make the clear point here, when we're talking about value, we're speaking about the difference between the value of people's labor and the value created by it. So again, the example of the physiocrats, they were looking at the peasantry in France, who are farmers, and they would, these farmers and the peasantry would, be growing crops and exporting them to city centers. And they would look at this value being created in terms of how many crops were grown and harvested, and how much did it take to maintain the peasantry? So the value of their labor power, how much do they have to eat to be able to get up every day and then go pick more crops and send them off, which is the value created. So the difference between the two is surplus value. So the physiocrats looked at the peasantry and saw that peasants ate a certain amount of food, but then exported a lot more, obviously, and that appeared very palpable and obvious in the sphere of agriculture, which is the primary branch of production for France at that particular time. And yeah, this total, the total means of subsistence which the peasant consumed, much smaller than the total means of subsistence, or subsistence meaning what you need to eat to survive, then he would produce. Now, in manufacturing, this was a little bit different, quite a bit different, which what Adam Smith and David Ricardo had more exposure to. And this was emerging much more rapidly in Britain and France during this period. And the worker in manufacturing did not directly produce either his means of subsistence or in excess of them, right? So if you worked in a pin factory, and you were making thousands and thousands of pins, obviously workers didn't go home and eat pins, right? So the worker wasn't directly producing the things that they needed to survive. So under manufacturing, this process is mediated. It's an indirect one, which operates through the various acts of circulation of all the commodities within the capitalist system. So, there'd be agriculture, there'd be a pin factory, there'd be a clothes factory, there'd be, a tool factory, whatever. And all of these different factories would put all of their products on the market, and then each worker would receive a wage for their particular work, go out and then have to buy each of those products on the market to survive. Whereas previously, in feudal relations of production, the household and the tighter knit community would produce most of the things that people needed to survive. And so this changed the idea of value, because you couldn't see value like the physiocrats did from a single worker producing the things that they needed. Because like I mentioned before, in manufacturing, with the worker who's making the pins, they don't eat pins. So it wasn't directly obvious the cost of the laborer's value and the value that they produced. So this development of the value concept in capitalism, which is the single most important feature of Smith's work, was an expression of this indirect mediated form taken by production under capitalism. And so this was equally true in the case of trying to understand, surplus value. So while this surplus appeared in the form of a surplus of use values, which is, agricultural products, and the physiocrats, no abstract conception was possible or even necessary from a pre-Smithian economics. So when we talk about things like use values, for example, this means basically like the value of things as used. So we'll talk a little bit more about surplus value as a theory next week. So it's not something we have to worry about too much now. Now, Smith's Wealth of Nations begins with an explanation of the benefits of the division of labor as the fundamental source of improvements in the productive power of labor. So in the mind of Smith, and hopefully you'll see this in your readings this week, who believed that private ownership is a natural, supra-historical system, so it's not defined by history, which is based upon human nature, and a social division of labor only seen possible in the form of commodity production. So through the mediation of the exchange of products, which is produced as commodities. So Smith saw the private ownership, the huge amount of things that started to be made as a natural process, and that the social division of labor, where like a laborer would just do one thing over and over again, another laborer would do a different thing over and over again to produce different products, was the natural order, and the exchange of these products on the market was an outcome of that social division of labor, and a rational one at that. So the appointment of labor to each production process is only possible by means of this capitalist mode of production based on producing commodities, where the labor power of numerous people, hundreds of people in factories, is purchased and managed under a given capitalist. So this theory of the division of labor naturally led Smith, who viewed the social division of labor as inherently linked to commodity production, to examine the fundamental laws of commodity production, which he called the law of value in the wealth of nations, which hopefully you'll see a little bit of in the readings this week. Now, there's quite a few areas in Smith's thinking which Ricardo will pick up from and we'll touch upon next week, and they're probably a bit tricky to go into now. But we can kind of see, even in the readings this week, how Smith's ideas result in the mistake of regarding labor as a real measure of value in itself, rather than grasping the labor objectified in the commodity as a measure of value. So instead of labor being the substance of value, Smith has in mind that the labor that a commodity can command or purchase. Right. So, and again, this is probably a bit of a difficult concept to conceptualize now, and it's something we'll build on very firmly next week. Smith thought about, a commodity and how much labor that commodity could purchase. So like, a coat, for example, would be worth a certain amount of labor. You could exchange it for a certain amount of labor, is how Smith saw the capitalist mode of production. But instead, and critical political economists later would describe this, is that the value of that particular commodity is the labor abstractly objectified within it, not so much how much labor it could be exchanged for. But I appreciate this is maybe a bit of a difficult discussion to have without next week's insight into the critical political economist. So I might just leave that there, and we'll pick that up next week when we have a bit more of a thorough understanding of classical political economists and the critical theorists. Now, moving on to David Ricardo, just to finish us off. And Ricardo's greatest single achievement was that of all his contemporaries, and he came just slightly after Smith, he recognized most clearly a dual conception of value in Smith, and aimed to overcome it, to make political economy a coherent and unified science. So this Ricardo did by trying to demonstrate that the determination of value created in society is won by labor time, right? Not just labor itself, not just people laboring away, but actually valuing the time that labor contributed in the production process, which then you could make consistent with the existence of wages. So, paying people by the hour, which still exists today. And then, profits and also rent. So using labor time rather than just abstract labor, which seems like a small difference, but is a really crucial one in the history of political economy, was important to actually understand value proper. And then, use that to measure, wages, to measure profits, to measure rent. And he even went further and attempted to show that the determination of value by labor time was the only sound basis on which the distribution of the social product between wages, profits, and rent could be properly explained. And this is a task that he saw as the major one facing political economy. So it was Ricardo's efforts to grapple with this theoretical problem of value left by Smith that he was forced to do quite a different method in analysis of economic phenomena. So Ricardo insisted that political economy must begin with one fundamental principle, which is the determination of value by the quantity of labor or labor time bestowed upon the production of the commodity, right? So again, political economy for Ricardo was about determining value by the quantity of labor time bestowed upon production of a commodity. So, when trying to understand the creation of value in a pin factory, Ricardo emphasized that it's important to have a look at how much, labor time is going into each one of those pins to understand the value of the production of pins on a large scale. And at the beginning of his book, which you might see in this week's readings, Ricardo says that the value of a commodity or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production, not on the greater or lesser compensation which is paid for that labor. So he's saying that, when producing like a coat, for example, it's the labor time that goes into making that coat, not the compensation which is paid to the laborer for that labor, right? It's the labor time which is vital. So this established kind of the fundamental principles of political economy and is the great historical achievement of Ricardo to look at labor time in the production process. Now, this is where we'll leave things for this week, and we'll pick up in next week's lecture on the critique of the classical political economists and investigate the revolutionizing significance of Karl Marx's critique of classical political economy based off the writings of Smith and Ricardo. And one thing that I'll try to do at the end of each lecture as well is to maybe, just to, I guess, think about some research questions that you could address for the topics that we deal with. And these will always be a little bit off the cuff and not very polished, but this is just to help you all think about the questions that you could create for the major research essay associated with this unit. So for example, today we've spoken about the early political economists, and one of a research question or research area that you might like to investigate here is, how was the idea of value conceived differently between Kisney, Smith, and Ricardo? Or what was the significance of Adam Smith and David Ricardo's contribution to the study of political economy? So that's it for today, and I won't talk about who cares, because I think I addressed this initially about why theory is important. And don't worry, we'll keep coming back to that. And like you'll see in the syllabus, our part one kind of looks at theory for the first 3 weeks. But once we move past part one and go to other, more contemporaneous aspects of our course, we'll keep circling back to theory and using theory to help understand the world around us. But thank you everyone for tuning into week one, and I'll see you in classes this week.